Florida released 200 red wolves into a Ecological national forest in March 2023 to solve an ecological crisis that had been building for 40 years. Within 6 months, the forest transformed. Deer populations that had exploded to unsustainable levels crashed by 35%. Vegetation that hadn't grown in decades started regenerating. Rivers that had been choked with erosion began clearing. And ecosystems that scientists thought were permanently damaged started healing themselves. But here's what nobody predicted. The wolves didn't just hunt deer and reduce their numbers. They changed deer behavior so dramatically that deer stopped eating in the areas where they'd destroyed vegetation for 4 decades. The wolves created what ecologists call a landscape of fear, and that fear restored an entire ecosystem faster than any human intervention could have achieved. This is how 200 wolves fixed an ecosystem that 40 years of forest management couldn't solve, why their impact was visible within months instead of decades, and what this reveals about predators being nature's ecosystem engineers. Ecological National Forest is 632,000 acres in the Florida Panhandle. In 1980, the last wolves in Florida were declared extinct. Without apex predators, the deer population exploded. By 2020, deer density had reached 80 deer per square mile in some areas. That's 4 times the carrying capacity that forests can sustain. Here's what happens when deer overpopulate without predators. Understory vegetation disappears first because deer browse on young trees, shrubs, and ground plants continuously. Without understory, forest floors become bare dirt. Without ground cover, rainfall washes topsoil directly into streams instead of being absorbed by vegetation. Erosion accelerates, rivers turn brown with sediment, fish populations collapse because spawning habitat gets buried in mud. The U.S. Forest Service tried everything. They increased hunting permits. They hired sharpshooters to cull deer from helicopters. They spent $12 million over 15 years on deer management programs. Nothing worked. Deer populations kept growing because hunting removed individual deer but didn't change deer behavior. The remaining deer continued browsing in the same patterns, preventing any vegetation recovery. But here's the fundamental problem with human hunting as population control. Hunters create temporary mortality. They kill deer, the population drops briefly, then rebounds within months, because remaining deer have access to more food. Red wolves are smaller than gray wolves, averaging 60 pounds compared to 100-pound gray wolves. They historically ranged throughout the southeastern United States before being hunted to extinction in the wild by 1980. The opposition was immediate and predictable. Ranchers claimed wolves would kill livestock. Hunters argued wolves would eliminate deer and destroy hunting opportunities. Rural residents feared for pet safety and children playing outside. The same arguments that opposed wolf reintroduction in Yellowstone in 1995, in Wisconsin in 2004, and in Colorado in 2023. But Florida had one advantage Yellowstone didn't have in 1995. They had 28 years of data from Yellowstone showing exactly what happens when wolves return to an ecosystem. They knew the concerns were overblown and the benefits were real. The question wasn't whether to do it. The question was whether Florida's ecosystem would respond the same way Yellowstone's did. Here's what the data from Yellowstone showed. After wolves were reintroduced in 1995, elk populations declined 50% within 10 years. But that wasn't the important part. The important part was that elk behavior changed immediately. Elk stopped congregating in valley bottoms where they'd overgrazed for decades. They moved to higher elevations and areas with better escape routes. This behavioral change allowed valley vegetation to recover, which stabilized stream banks, which reduced erosion, which improved water quality, which restored fish populations. The entire ecosystem transformed through a cascade of effects triggered by predator-induced fear. Florida released 200 red wolves in March 2023 across 3 zones in Ecological National Forest. The wolves came from captive breeding programs where red wolves had been preserved since their extinction in the wild. They were fitted with GPS collars to track their movements and impacts. Wildlife biologists prepared to monitor changes over years. Nobody expected to see results in months. Within 30 days of release, GPS collar data showed wolves had established territories covering approximately 180,000 acres. That's about 900 acres per wolf, which is smaller than wolf territories in western states, but consistent with red wolf territory sizes in historical records. The wolves found each other, formed packs of 5 to 8 individuals, and began hunting. Here's what happened next. Camera traps placed throughout the forest showed deer behavior changing within weeks. Deer stopped bedding down in open meadows where they'd been sleeping for decades. They stopped browsing in valley bottoms where vegetation was most accessible. They moved to terrain with better sightlines and faster escape routes. The deer weren't being hunted to extinction. They were being scared into different patterns. By month 3, vegetation surveys showed measurable regrowth. Areas that had been bare dirt for years started showing seedling emergence. Young oak, maple, and pine trees that had been browsed to death for 4 decades were suddenly growing to 3 feet tall. Wildlife cameras captured the reason. Deer were spending 70% less time in valley meadows and near streams. They'd visit to drink water, then leave immediately. They were nervous, alert, and constantly moving. But here's the mechanism that makes this work. Wolves don't need to kill massive numbers of deer to impact the ecosystem. They just need to be present. The mere risk of predation changes prey behavior more than actual predation does. Ecologists call this the landscape of fear. Deer perceive certain areas as dangerous because wolves could be there. So they avoid those areas even when wolves aren't present. This avoidance allows vegetation in those areas to recover. By month 3, wolves had killed an estimated 180 deer. That's less than 1 deer per wolf. In a forest with over 50,000 deer, 180 deaths is statistically insignificant. But those 180 kills created fear in thousands of deer. And that fear changed their behavior across hundreds of square miles. The kills weren't the point. The fear was the point. By September 2023, 6 months after release, the transformation was undeniable. Understory vegetation density had increased 23% in core wolf territory areas. That's decades of recovery happening in half a year. Streambank erosion measurements showed 15% reduction in sediment loading. Water quality tests detected improved clarity in tributaries that flow through wolf territories. But here's where it gets interesting. The changes weren't uniform across the forest. They were concentrated in areas where wolves spent the most time. GPS collar data showed wolves preferred valleys, meadows, and areas near water because that's where deer concentrated. These were the exact areas where deer had caused the most damage over 40 years. The wolves naturally gravitated to the locations that needed them most. Bird populations responded immediately. Species that nest in understory vegetation, like wood thrushes and hooded warblers, showed increased nesting activity in wolf territory. These birds had been declining in Apalachicola for decades because ground-level vegetation where they nest had disappeared. Within 6 months of wolf return, their nesting habitat was regenerating. Small mammal populations also rebounded. Rabbits, squirrels, and mice that rely on understory cover for protection from aerial predators started increasing in wolf zones. This seems counterintuitive because wolves eat these animals. But the benefit of restored vegetation outweighed the risk of wolf predation. More habitat meant more small mammals, even with predators present. The river system showed the most dramatic changes. Streams in wolf territory that had been brown with sediment for decades started running clear. Vegetation regeneration along stream banks stabilized soil that had been eroding into waterways for years. Aquatic insect populations increased as sediment decreased. Fish surveys detected spawning activity in stream sections that hadn't supported reproduction in over a decade. Here's the cascade effect in action. Wolves create fear. Fear changes deer behavior. Changed behavior allows vegetation recovery. Vegetation stabilizes soil. Stabilized soil reduces erosion. Reduced erosion improves water quality. Improved water quality supports aquatic ecosystems. And aquatic ecosystem health supports terrestrial species that depend on healthy waterways. One predator at the top triggers benefits that cascade down through every level of the ecosystem. One of the biggest fears about wolf reintroduction was that wolves would eliminate deer entirely, destroying hunting opportunities and creating new ecological imbalances. 6 months of data proved this fear was completely wrong. The deer population in wolf zones decreased 35% by September 2023. That sounds dramatic until you understand what it means. The forest was carrying 80 deer per square mile in 2022. By September 2023, wolf zones had approximately 52 deer per square mile. That's still well above the sustainable carrying capacity of 20 to 30 deer per square mile. The deer weren't disappearing. They were returning to historically sustainable population levels. But here's what the 35% reduction actually represents. About 8% came from direct wolf predation. The other 27% came from deer leaving wolf territories and redistributing to other areas of the forest. GPS collar data on deer showed they were moving to zones where wolves weren't present. The deer didn't die. They moved. This is exactly what ecologists predicted and exactly what happened in Yellowstone. Hunter success rates actually improved in wolf zones. This seems impossible if wolves are killing deer and scaring others away. But here's why it makes sense. With fewer deer competing for food, remaining deer were healthier, larger, and easier to hunt. Hunters reported seeing bigger bucks and having higher quality hunt experiences, even though total deer numbers decreased. The key insight is that deer population density isn't the same as deer population health. Apalachicola had high density and low health. Small and struggling because there wasn't enough food to support their numbers. After wolf reintroduction, density decreased, but health improved. Better for the ecosystem, and ultimately better for sustainable hunting. While scientists expected vegetation recovery and stream restoration, several impacts caught everyone by surprise. The most significant was the return of beavers. Beavers had been absent from Apalachicola National Forest since the early 2000s. The reason was simple. Without understory vegetation, there were no willow or aspen trees for beavers to eat and use for dam construction. Beavers need specific vegetation to survive, and that vegetation had been eliminated by deer overbrowsing. By November 2023, 8 months after wolf reintroduction, wildlife biologists documented beaver activity in 3 separate stream systems in wolf territory. Beavers had moved in from adjacent areas where small populations still existed. They found regenerating willow and aspen in wolf zones and established lodges. Here's why beaver return matters enormously. Beavers are ecosystem engineers just like wolves. Their dams create wetlands. Wetlands support dozens of species that can't survive in flowing streams. Amphibians, waterfowl, fish, aquatic plants, and countless invertebrates depend on beaver-created wetlands. The return of beavers triggered a second cascade of ecosystem benefits, on top of the benefits wolves already created. Another unexpected benefit was wildfire risk reduction. Apalachicola National Forest had become a tinderbox after years of drought and vegetation loss. Bare ground with no understory meant dead plant material accumulated on the surface with nothing to break it down. This created dangerous fuel loads that could support catastrophic wildfires. Here's what changed after wolf reintroduction. As understory vegetation recovered, it shaded the forest floor and retained moisture. This created microclimates that stayed cooler and wetter than exposed bare ground. Decomposition rates increased. Dead material broke down faster instead of accumulating. Fuel loads decreased. Fire risk assessments showed measurable reduction in wildfire danger in wolf zones compared to areas without wolves. Wolf reintroduction cost $4.8 million. That included capture and breeding program costs, GPS collars, transportation, monitoring equipment, and first-year research. It sounds expensive until you compare it to the alternatives. The U.S. Forest Service had spent $12 million on deer management between 2008 and 2022. Helicopter sharpshooter programs, expanded hunting permits, fencing, and vegetation restoration efforts that all failed to achieve lasting results. That's $12 million for temporary fixes that didn't solve the underlying problem. But here's the economic comparison. Wolves are self-sustaining. After the initial $4.8 million investment, they reproduce naturally, hunt continuously, and maintain deer populations without ongoing human intervention. The cost drops to monitoring expenses of approximately $200,000 per year. Over a decade, that's $2 million in monitoring versus $12 million in failed management programs. The economic benefits extended beyond cost savings. Ecotourism increased immediately. Wildlife photographers, wolf watchers, and nature enthusiasts traveled to Apalakella to see wolves in the wild. Local hotels, restaurants, and guide services reported increased bookings specifically related to wolf viewing opportunities. The Economic Impact Study commissioned by Florida Wildlife Commission estimated wolf-related tourism generated $3.2 million in revenue in the first 6 months. Property values near the national forest increased 8% on average. This contradicts predictions that wolf presence would decrease property values. But the data showed people were willing to pay premiums to live near restored ecosystems with healthy wildlife populations. The abstract fear of wolves was less important than the tangible benefit of living near thriving natural areas. Ranchers predicted livestock losses would be catastrophic. By December 2023, 9 months after release, confirmed wolf kills of livestock totaled 6 calves. Total economic loss was $8,400. The state compensation program paid ranchers $10,500 for verified losses. This is statistically insignificant compared to losses from disease, weather, and other causes that kill hundreds of cattle annually in the same region. But here's what changed rancher attitudes. The state implemented proactive measures, including range riders who monitor wolf activity near cattle, and electric fencing subsidies for ranchers near wolf territories. These measures cost $180,000 in year 1, but reduced conflict to almost zero. Ranchers realized wolves weren't the threat they feared when proper management was in place. Hunters initially opposed wolf reintroduction, claiming it would destroy deer hunting. By hunting season 2023, 9 months after wolves arrived, hunter feedback surveys showed 68% of hunters reported positive or neutral experiences. Many hunters specifically mentioned seeing healthier deer and appreciated the challenge of hunting in ecosystems with natural predation. The fear of children and pets being attacked never materialized. 0 confirmed human-wolf interactions occurred in the first year. 0 pet attacks in areas adjacent to the national forest. Red wolves are naturally wary of humans and avoid populated areas. The fears were based on misconceptions about wolf behavior, not actual wolf biology. The Florida wolf reintroduction demonstrated what Yellowstone showed 28 years earlier. You can try for decades and spend millions and fail repeatedly because the fundamental architecture of healthy ecosystems requires top-down regulation that only predators provide. Here's the principle. Ecosystems evolved with predators at the top of food chains. Remove the predators and the entire structure destabilizes. Prey populations explode. Vegetation disappears. Erosion accelerates. Water quality degrades. Biodiversity collapses. The ecosystem slides towards simplified, degraded states that can't support the complexity of species that historically thrived there. But here's what makes predators special. They regulate through fear as much as through killing. A landscape of fear created by predator presence changes prey behavior across entire territories. This behavioral change allows vegetation recovery that would be impossible if prey continued browsing without concern. You can't replicate this effect with human hunting because humans don't create the constant, pervasive presence that predators provide. Florida's wolves fixed in 6 months what 40 years of management couldn't solve because wolves do what humans can't. They hunt 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, creating persistent pressure that changes prey behavior fundamentally. They're self-sustaining, requiring no ongoing human intervention once established, and they trigger cascade effects that spread through ecosystems in ways that human management strategies never achieve. The transformation of Apalachicola National Forest from degraded deer-dominated wasteland to recovering complex ecosystem happened because 200 wolves created fear. That fear changed behavior allowed recovery, and recovery proved that nature knows how to heal itself when given the right tools. The wolves didn't transform the landscape overnight through some magical mechanism. They transformed it overnight because their presence immediately changed deer behavior. And deer behavior had been the underlying cause of ecosystem degradation for 40 years. Fix the cause and effects resolve themselves naturally. Florida's wolves aren't a conservation experiment anymore. They're proof that restoring apex predators restores ecosystems faster and more effectively than any amount of human management can achieve. The landscape transformed because predators are ecosystem engineers whose impact extends far beyond the prey they kill to the behavior they change and the fear they create.